Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk with you today. I love maps, and we all love maps, right? But what do we really mean? Do we simply love what they look like as objects? Or maybe it goes deeper, and we love how they help our understanding of something, or at least we think we do. So to what extent do we know that what they're telling us is true? Do we all have an equal innate ability to decipher the often complex messages they sometimes contain? Can they be trusted? Which maps we perceive as right or wrong depends largely on the perspective, beliefs and biases we hold as much as what we see in the map itself. So a very famous Welsh politician, Aneurin Bevan, uttered these words in the late 1940s. "This is my truth, tell me yours." And what was inferred from this was the way in which politicians of the time seemingly avoided telling the truth in favour of alternative facts. But what he was really saying was, well, this is what I believe, but I'm open and willing to listen to your opinion too. We can apply Bevan's quote to our domain of maps, of course, and this presentation is really about the alternative truths we can find in maps. Perhaps we can identify maps that are right and those that are wrong. Actually, it's likely that none are right and equally none are wrong. Instead, they all tell different shades of the truth. Michael Correll recently characterised that there's basically three types of people when it comes to making maps. There's honest people, there's liars, and there's the BS artists. So we're already into ethical territory if we consider these three types of people. Remember, both an honest person and a liar are at least interested in the truth. The honest person wants to tell you the truth, so they have to know what the truth is, whereas the liar wants to convince you of something that they know is not true, which also entails that they know what is actually true. They're just choosing to say the opposite. The BS artist, by contrast, couldn't care less about what is true or false. Their goal is just to say whatever will accomplish their aim, and they don't much care if what they're saying is true or not. And Bergstrom and West's excellent book also focuses on the need for skepticism as we view and try to interpret maps and charts and figure out the extent of their truthfulness. And there's often a mismatch between the goals of good map design, communicating nuanced and important information to wide audiences, and the goal of data decoration, which is really just there to make some numbers look pretty on a map. And in our world of limited attention spans, maps are often decorated first to grab attention, like this map. It's simple data, it's presented in an attention-grabbing way, but it's to the detriment of the subject matter, which might be better displayed on a different map product altogether or a different type of map. Half the globe is missing. You can't compare the prism lengths. What do the colours even mean? Take this map of the location of tourists, which are in red, versus locals, which are in blue in London. The map claims to show incredible new detail about demographic, social and cultural patterns. But does it? Just because we're told it does, doesn't necessarily mean it actually does. The data being used here is from geotagged tweets. Only 1% of all tweets, 13% of which are imprecise. Only 67% of internet users use social media, and of those, only 16% use Twitter, and they're mostly adults between 18 and 29, male and white. So, is this really truly representative of a map that's showing us where tourists are versus where locals are? This is a classic example of a so-called fake map. It's a very famous photograph taken by Reuters journalist Trey Yingst as President Trump moved into the White House in 2017. Who wouldn't have a map of their victory on their wall? I certainly would. Now, Reuters quotes Trump as saying, "Here, you can take that, that's the final map of the numbers. It's pretty good, right? The red is obviously us." This sort of map presents a somewhat partisan view of the truth. It maps geography and shades every single area on the map according to the share of vote. Population density isn't taken account of, and the map design decisions have modified the message in a very specific way. Now, this map suited President Trump's view of the truth, and other truths exist. So in early March 2018, I made this map. It's a Daisometric density map of the 2016 election results. One vote is symbolised by one dot on this map. But of course, somebody picked this up and the memes started. And this one in particular I really liked, from Thomas de Boer, and he mashed up my map into Trey Yingst's photograph. And really what he was trying to say in this commentary, this meme, is questioning which map appears more truthful to you. But they're both correct. But depending on what your political stance is, you are going to gravitate to one more than the other as a means of reflecting what you already believe, and therefore what the truth that is conveyed by the map shows to you or speaks to you. So I got permission from Trey Yinks to actually use his image, his photograph, in my 2018 book, Cartography, to explore the issue of ethics and what constitutes a truthful map. Maps may be accidentally disingenuous about the content. I don't think this one is. They use misguided construction or techniques. I don't think this one is either. Or they may even be deliberately designed to be persuasive or propagandist. Well, I may think this is persuasive. It may be that the person that made it didn't know what they were doing, and it just happened to be, some defaults that they chose with reds and blues, and that's how the map came out. Or it might not be. We don't know, because I don't know who made that map. The ability to accidentally or deliberately make a map in ways that might misconstrue meaning raises these sorts of questions. So how do we, as makers of maps, attempt to bring truth and objectivity to the process? Well, Borden Dent outlined a code of ethics for map makers in his excellent book, Thematic Map Design, back in 2008. This, I think, was the 3rd edition. I borrowed that and updated it and modified it for that page on ethics in my own book. And I think they provide a very useful, practical way of thinking about and applying ethics to the practice of making maps. Let's dive into some examples of how you can change the message of a map using a single example. And the example I'm going to pick up on is the 2016 presidential election data at county or county equivalent level, most of all. It's my attempt to explain and to illustrate how meaning in a map can be designed for good or ill intent and to mediate the message. It's useful for both map makers, but also for map consumers who need to be better able to recognise and question what they're seeing. And those web maps actually became the starting point for the book I've just written, which is out currently as an ebook called Thematic Mapping, 101 Inspiring Ways to Visualise Empirical Data. Almost the first topic deals with map projections, and it's important to emphasise that thematic maps of statistical data at a medium to small scale demand an equal area projection. Anything else is a lie, and it's one which I think is further than a white lie, which causes all sorts of visual incongruities for the reader. This example of Web Mercator illustrates the enormous problems of using that default for the US, with Alaska being shown 4 times its actual size relative to the lower 48. It just doesn't work because it overemphasizes whatever data is portrayed in those more northerly areas of the map. So Alba's equal area, conic, works very well for the US, and I've actually positioned Alaska and Hawaii as insets down in the bottom to help the layout as well. Yes, I've moved geography. It's a white lie, but it's a white lie in this case that actually helps the overall page display. I was able to discuss colour choices to some extent, and not only the issue of red-blue, but the impact for people with different colour vision. The key here was to establish whether red and blue for the 2 different parties was a viable option. These tests actually showed that it is. It's only really maps in grayscale, so using the monochrome palettes, where problems are going to arise. So supporting a wide range of colour vision is critical, certainly for accessibility. In the first chapter, there's also a whole section on the impact of redistricting or gerrymandering. In this hypothetical example, you can see how 100 people, or votes, or congressional districts, depending on what you want to attribute to each small square, can be geographically tallied in very different ways to arrive at a completely different outcome at an aggregated level, e.g. a state. I was also able to explore typical problems that I see in thematic map design. So here, for instance, is a map of the total number of votes for Republicans in 2016 election by county. But it's an expected distribution because you would expect more votes in more populated areas, regardless of whether Republicans won those areas or not. What you have to do here is accommodate different population densities to show a rate which can be compared like for like across the map. So exactly the same data has now been normalized as a percentage to account for the population. So this is the percentage share of vote for the Republican Party, and you get a completely different message from this map than the previous one. A lot of highly populated counties went Democrat, many more, but lower populated places were fervently Republican. And that is what this map allows you to compare. What happens if you categorize or you bin that data in different ways? Again, it affects the way in which the map looks. So the message is further mediated by choices made in how data is classified. So here's the standard sort of results map, I guess the headline map, the blue-red map of the result by state. What this map does very interestingly is show a much larger proportion of red in totality than blue in totality. This is shading land area in a block of colour, which doesn't necessarily reflect the true distribution of voting in the US. It's a summary, it's not incorrect, but it does give much more weight to, let's say, a state like Montana, which has a very low population density, but is an extremely large state. Compare that with Texas, which is shown at roughly the same size as Montana, but has a much larger population, obviously much more electoral college votes as well. So even in this results map, it's not untruthful, but it's depicting the result in a way that seems to emphasize certain areas more than others. But we can, of course, get into some more interesting techniques to perhaps overcome some of that visual bias. This is a value by alpha map at county or county equivalent level. It's got much more detail. It uses a blended hue that meets a purple in the middle. So I'm showing both the share of vote here, the margin of victory here for both Democrat and Republican, tending towards more blue in areas that were increasingly Democratic and tending towards more red in areas that were increasingly Republican. And an opaqueness where the population is more sparse. So you're muting out some of that colour as it sort of tends more towards the background of the map itself. It has the effect of downplaying all of that high share of the vote, but from areas that are sparsely populated. Perhaps it's a more balanced, more nuanced version of the results. Some might say it's more truthful, it's different. We can also change the map to focus on a narrative which, for many elections, surrounds those precincts, counties, or even states that flipped, compared to those that didn't. It's where elections are won or lost. So if we mute all those areas that voted the same in 2012 and 2016, this is what we're left with. Simply the counties that flipped, and by how much, because we've changed the colour of the county by margin of victory. And if we're thinking about how states have changed perhaps over time, from one cycle to another, and how they've flipped back and forth, we might use small multiples. Here shown state results from 1920 to 2016. So longer term trends can be teased out by looking at maps from different periods. And what might a Hillary Clinton victory map have looked like hanging on the wall in the White House? Well, we'll never know, of course, but this is a proportional symbol map of the popular vote. It's predominantly blue, as Clinton took many small counties with large populations. Trump, by contrast, took many more counties, but they were a lot smaller. And as we know, popular vote doesn't count, so the mass of small red symbols ultimately overawed the much larger blue symbols. We could also riff off party symbology and create proportional symbols reporting the electoral college result. Here this map just juxtaposes the popular vote we just saw by translating the state wins into electoral college votes. We can see how the balance of red comes back into play, particularly in states like Texas and Florida. And here's my version of the Daisometric density map that I somewhat hurriedly tweeted. It really does emphasize how much of the US is unpopulated or very sparsely populated. And it also mixes the dot colors, so many places aren't as blue or as red as it might at first seem. Many places are actually a lot more similar than they are different. If you include some topographic detail, which is very rare on a thematic map, it actually helps explain the settlement patterns as well as showing the result, particularly towards the west with the mountain ranges. Most maps try to show where places are similar, and this one focuses on dissimilarity by symbolising the boundaries themselves. Imagine a chat over you and your neighbour's fence. This map shows where neighbours voted the same way and by how much, and it also shows where neighbours voted for different candidates and by how much. So you actually end up with large tracts of the US voting in very similar ways, punctuated by small enclaves of differing support. And going back to that idea of just selecting areas that went a particular way, here we're emphasising the counties that flipped again, but also using a different symbology style. Brighter symbols are a stronger flip. The revealing of patterns from the noise of the whole data set is part of the craft of cartography, and I think this map helps to do that. This one doesn't, but I made this one simply for fun. It's really just a series of transects of stripes across the country with the height of the line or the depth of the line showing greater share of the vote. Red is above a baseline and blue is below. The stars are the cities, coloured red or blue to show the way their closest counties voted. We can get inventive with cartograms. These warp geography to accommodate different population densities. Here's a non-contiguous cartogram where each state is resized according to the total vote and coloured according to margin of victory. It puts the relative proportion of colour into the correct amount as a proportion of the overall colour. This map has visual balance. It also looks a little bit like a llama. And this one looks kind of crazy. You've probably already had a visceral reaction to this as I've been speaking. It's a population density equalising cartogram. People tend to either love these or hate them. They're pretty hard to unravel if you're unfamiliar with the area being mapped. Labels become hugely important to give us a sense of where places actually are. This is exactly the same map that President Trump hung on the wall of the White House. It's just contorted by population density. This is a mashup of a cartogram technique with another technique called Chernoff faces, where facial features are used to represent results relative to different social and economic conditions of that county. It packs a massive amount of information in, but there's questions over its readability. This harks back to one of my opening statements. Does a map have to be simple? Complexity isn't bad in cartography if it can be presented with care and legibility. And perhaps the counter to that is the quick throwaway infographic style of decorating numbers. There's plenty of opportunity to make a non-map to tell the story. Here, bunches of party balloons are also proportional symbols, so there's more red balloons. This is a waffle grid approach, and what works well here is each cell of the grid is equivalent to 20,000 votes. Most states are very evenly matched between red and blue than we might otherwise see on the alternative maps that I've shown you to this point. Even in what are regarded as quite partisan states, I was surprised to see a much closer picture emerge of how America is far more aligned than divided. Let's look at a few 3D maps. Now, the book mostly illustrates maps that are designed to show what you can do and what might be considered best practices. This one is different. It illustrates how to make a wonderfully impactful map that's broadly useless. The Choropleth is again President Trump's White House map with a total vote encoded in the Z dimension to create vertical prisms. They stick out at odd angles. It makes it impossible to compare them across the map. So we have to deal with occlusion and foreshortening as a map reader, and our brains really aren't very well attuned to doing that. I'd call this a pretty map, and it's engaging in that sense. It doesn't mean that 3D isn't useful. Here's the same map, but displayed in an isometric projection, which is a way of positioning the point of view so that scale is equivalent across the map. You can compare the height of one prism to another, and your eyes will not be deceiving you. So unless you want to give me another hour, that's pretty much it. The point is, with so many design choices, fake maps or alternative maps are abound. You can make a map that says anything you want, and people are making them. And it's worth reiterating that bar one or two, none of the maps I've shown you are right or wrong, but they all tell different versions of the truth. Some will have spoken to you more than others, some speak to me more than others. If you're designing maps to report statistical data, it behoves you to appreciate how your choices impact how the map will be read. More widely, being able to recognize bias in a map's representation is a really important issue because maps play to people's views, opinions, and search for the truth. All maps lie to an extent. It's the extent of that lie that's important to recognize and keep in mind. And this is where Bevan's quote ended up on the back cover of the book. This is my truth, tell me yours. So with that, once again, I'll thank you very much for inviting me. and we'll head into some Q&A. Let's have some interesting questions. Thank you very much.